Welcome to everyone who's joined us already. We will get started at 9:30. Welcome to everyone who's joined us so far. We'll get started in a couple minutes. Hello and welcome to our leather use in treatment seminar. I just want to point out a few things about our Zoom webinar today. We do have closed captioning available. You just need to click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and you can choose to either have captions or a live transcript of the program. We are recording this session, just as an FYI. And then you can ask questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your question. And the panelists may decide to answer your question as it comes in, or to hold it in for the question and answer session. But it helps us for you to ask the questions as you're thinking of them. So just open up the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen and type in your question when you have a question. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Katie Wagner.
Thank you, Ruth, and welcome, as Ruth said, to Leather Use and Treatment, a U.S. and European panel presentation on the impact of conservators' choices. My name is Katie Wagner, and I'm the Senior Book Conservator with Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. This session is brought to you by the Leather Discussion Group, which was formed in 2016 by book conservators with the goal of expanding the discussion about leather to users and conservators across disciplines. The group consists of Bill Minter from Penn State University Libraries, Holly Herro, and Kristi Wright from the National Library of Medicine, and myself. The 6 session topics that are being discussed today arose as part of an ongoing inquiry into leather deterioration. During the spring of 2021, we met virtually with a variety of leather users, sometimes in group sessions and sometimes virtually in person, individually. We also gathered responses via survey format. The responses inspired these discussion topics. Start with a land acknowledgement. I begin today's session by acknowledging the land in Alexandria, Virginia, where I'm speaking to you from today, borders the unceded land of the Nacotchtank people, for whom the Anacostia River is named. The Nacotchtank were traders in the thriving area where the Potomac and Anacostia rivers meet. Driven north by colonists, the tribe merged with the Piscataway people. I pay my respects to their past, present, and future elders. So these are our moderators. Holly, Kristi, and I will be the moderators, and the panelists include David Lanning, Renee Larson, Jesse Meyer, Bill Minter, and Laura Ryrick. We will introduce them individually in a moment. Our panelists have pre-recorded answers to some of the 6 topics related to leather use during conservation treatment. All of our panelists, with the exception of David Lanning, are here today to join in the live Q&A sessions. After we listen to each set of topic answers, the pre-recorded ones, the panelists and the moderators will have 5 to 10 minutes to discuss amongst themselves. As Ruth said, place your questions in the chat. The panelists will try and answer your questions as we go, but there will also be a 15-minute Q&A session at the very end for attendees. Now we'll move on to introducing our panelists, and I'll turn it over to Kristi. Oh, this is our agenda for today, sorry. Just so you know, there is a 15-minute break, and there are some demonstration videos to break up the recordings. All right, now over to you, Kristi.
Thank you, Katie. Our first panelist today is Mr. David Lanning. David has been at leather manufacturer and bookbinding supplier J. Hewitt & Sons Limited since 1987. He came to Hewitt's by way of an agricultural and farming background, with an expertise in growing bananas and avocados. But that, as they say, is another story. He started at Hewitt's in the position of London sales manager and was appointed a director of the company with overall responsibility for sales and marketing in 1991. As a director at Hewitt's, David is passionate about all things bookbinding, encompassing conservation, restoration, craft, and trade. Although he has never wielded a bone folder or paring knife in anger, he considers himself quite a competent armchair bookbinder. He is a past president of the Society of Bookbinders and the Institute of Bookbinding and Allied Trades. While David is not able to join us for today's discussions, he kindly sent responses to multiple questions. Our second panelist and demonstrator today is Dr. Renee Larson. Renee is a conservator and educator. He holds a Master of Science in Conservation from the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Art and a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Copenhagen. He is the former rector of the School of Conservation, Copenhagen, co-founder of the European Network for Conservation Restoration Education, or ENCORE, and external expert European Commission DG Research. At present, he is chairman of the board and researcher at Conservation Zealand Knowledge Center for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. His areas of research expertise include the deterioration, identification, and conservation of cultural leather, parchment, and skin, including the development of methods and techniques for analysis and diagnosis of the same. Presently, his research centers on archaeological leather and the development project, the sulfur-free full vegetable tanned and sustainable calf leather for bookbinding, together with Eric Arthemen and Stephen Siegel. He was the scientific coordinator of the European Commission, or EC, STEP Leather Project, as well as the EC Environment Leather Project, EC MAP Project, EC IDAP Project and scientific partner, and the EC Memory Project.
Jesse Meyer is the current owner and president of Pergamena Parchment and Leathers. His family's been tanning leather for 470 plus years. They are currently producing vegetable tan leather for use in conservation as well as leather goods. Additionally, they are one of a small number of producers of animal skin parchments around the world, specializing in parchment for book and manuscript production and interior design. Self-taught, Jesse has spent many years experimenting and researching formulas and methods to improve Pergamena's leather and parchment offerings. Pergamena prides itself on employing traditional processes while trying to adapt to modern applications and aesthetics. William, or Bill Minter, is a founding member of the Leather Discussion Group. He began his career with a Chicago-based printing company where he met Bill Anthony, noted fine binder and book conservator. Bill Anthony became his immediate supervisor, and within a short time, Bill began a 7-year apprenticeship with a master binder. In 1978, Bill started his own book conservation practice in Chicago that later moved to Pennsylvania. In 2014, Bill was named Senior Book Conservator for the Pennsylvania State University Libraries, also known as Penn State. Bill is known for his inventive character with many different items to his credit, with the most notable being the ultrasonic welder for polyester film encapsulation. Dr. Laura Wright received a PhD in microbiology and bioethics from Penn State in 2012. She completed a postdoc and established her own research team at the University of Adelaide. She is now director of the Penn State Ancient Biomolecules Research Laboratory at Penn State, where she is also an associate professor of anthropology. The cornerstone of her research is reconstructing ancient microbial communities or microbiomes from humans, animals, and the environment. Her team was the first to reconstruct the microbiome of an extinct species of Neanderthals and has reassembled one of the oldest microbial genomes to date at 48,000 years old. We also wanted to note here that Eric Arthemen will be joining us as a panelist during the discussion Q&A portions. He is currently the export manager for leather chemicals and applications at Gruppo Biochimica in Italy. He has a bachelor's degree in chemistry from a Dutch college and a degree in leather chemistry and leather application technology from the Lederinstitut Gewerbeschule Reutlingen in Germany. And now we're going to hand it over to Bill.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe. And we're very pleased that you could join us. My comments today will be a brief introduction into the selection of leather for a particular project. During the rest of today's discussion, our panel of tanners and researchers will help us get a better understanding of the leather that we use. As we start, I will be using the term book conservator, but many of these comments will also apply to the bookbinder who works on new design bindings. First, we should agree that the conservator should always be looking for the very best materials, including leather. Considering the time and the effort that we expend on a project, there is no good reason to use anything but the very best materials. While today's book conservator has a good understanding about the quality of paper, we know very little about the quality of the leather that we use. Sadly, we see many leather bindings from the early 1900s that have failed, and we are concerned about our own work. So how does a conservator select a skin of leather for a project? What are the determining factors? Traditionally, we trust the quality based on the tanner. We trust the reputation of the tanner, and we trust that the chemistry that has been used will produce the very best leather. We may have learned about selecting leather from our bookbinding teacher, or maybe through an organization such as AIC or the Guild of Bookworkers. Fortunately, the Guild of Bookworkers has an annual conference called Standards of Excellence, where tanners show their leathers and offer their advice when it comes to selecting a skin. Typically, a book conservator is looking for a vegetable tanned leather as opposed to a chrome tanned leather. Veg tanned leather can be easily pared to the desired thickness, and the leather can be molded over raised bands and allow for neat corners. Vegetable tanned leather can also be tooled and decorated in a variety of ways. Unfortunately, we rarely discuss the type of tanning when we're meeting with a tanner. So here again, we rely upon the tanner's expertise and their reputation. Today, many tanners will use sumac as their primary tanning agent, whereas maybe in the past, oak bark or mimosa has been used. And of course, there are other treatments. And we should not forget that there is also alum tawed leather, but of course, that is not a tanned leather. And so it is also available from some of our suppliers. But today, we're just going to focus on tanned leathers. So beyond the tannage, there are still many other factors to consider. After knowing that a skin has been vegetable tanned, we will probably look for a specific grain pattern. Specific grains, such as goat skin, which are, shall we say, textured skins, are going to be available from the tanner. But if we're looking for a smooth skin, we will probably be using a goat skin, or I'm sorry, a calf skin. We would probably avoid using any type of sheepskin because of the known properties of its splitting when it's in use. The second on our list of characteristics might be the color. Of course, we can get a colored skin or a dyed skin from the tanner, and that color has been penetrated throughout the entire skin. There are also pigmented skins that are available, and these might even have an artificial graining to them. But we probably, as conservators, we want to avoid those skins since we do not know much about how well such a skin will age. Of course, there's also undyed skins, and many people will choose an undyed so that they can select the particular type of color that they want. But here, this raises a question about the penetration of that dye. It probably will not penetrate throughout the entire skin as the tanner has been able to achieve in their processing. But at the same time, we need to understand that if you're using an alcohol-based dye, that the alcohol could have an effect on the long-term properties of the leather. So if you're going to be using a dye to dye a skin yourself, you should probably be looking at a water-based dye. But here again, we have questions, and you'll see some of the comments from the researchers and the tanners as we move forward through this program. The next thing that we should consider is the size of the skin. Of course, as the skin is much larger, it's going to have a greater thickness, and that thickness may be necessary for a large book such as the Audubon's Birds of America. Now, not many of us get an opportunity to bind this size of book, but there are books that, of course, are in between the Audubon and this palm-sized book that you can see here shown in the slide. So there's quite a range there, and realize that the thickness of the skin, the original thickness of that skin, is going to be a factor when it comes to the strength of that skin. And this relates to the corium of the skin. According to research done by Betty Haynes, and this was shown in the book Conservation of Leather, research has shown that if you take a skin that was originally 1.4 millimeters thick, and then you thin that down to approximately half to 0.6 millimeters, this results in a loss of about 80% of the strength of that skin. So here again, if the skin is very thick and it's been thinned down to a 0.6, you're losing quite a bit of the strength of that skin. One of the other factors that we're going to look at is going to be the blemishes on a natural skin. Now, of course, if one is looking at a first quality skin, you're not going to see any of the scratch marks from the courier. You're not going to see any warts or ringworm or growth marks and everything. A first grade skin is going to be near perfect overall. However, depending upon the type of the binding that you're using, perhaps you might want to use a second or a third grade skin. Of course, there's a little bit of a savings in the cost of that skin. But this particular skin right here, you can see that there's a couple of marks from the tanner or from the courier that have resulted in the marks being right on the spine of the animal, right near where one would want to use the skin. So consequently, this is probably, it's really unfortunate that this blemish is in such a particular location. And as we're looking at this particular skin, of course, most of us would want to cut the leather directly out of the skin so as to use the spine of the animal on the spine of the book. One of the things that we have learned as the leather discussion group is that as we're looking at skins and everything, we realize that it would be very helpful if we had dated and identified the tanner that we've purchased these skins from. This would be very helpful as we move forward with using that skin, especially if something were to happen when the skin has been stored in your particular location. But as I've looked at my skins, I've realized that I wish that I had dated these skins because some of them are now, in some cases, are 30 years old, and they're kind of, in some cases, showing signs of deterioration, which is not very good. I'm not saying that that's happened with any of the skins that I purchased from some of our current tanners, but I did pick up some skins from another binder many years ago, and if they had been identified, it would be very helpful to know that, oh, this one is not very, very good. Anyway, I'm going to end with an anecdote about selecting a quality of skin of leather. According to Marion Titcomb, who has researched many, many binders, especially Cobden Saunderson and others, Cobden Saunderson was very concerned about the quality of the leather that he would use back in the early 1900s when he was a binder. For those of you that are unaware of him, he was a lawyer before he became a noted bookbinder. Anyway, according to Miss Titcomb, Cobden Saunderson would select a skin based on a number of factors, and those include the feel of the skin, the workability of the skin. But the thing that I really want to leave you with is that according to Miss Titcomb, Cobden Saunderson would taste the skin. And if the skin was, if he felt it was too acidic, he would not use that skin. Now, in the illustration here, we've got one of his bindings on the very top, and it's still in very good condition as compared to another binding from the same period of time. And you can see that the boards have already become detached. So his technique of tasting his leather has worked thus far, and it's very interesting that he used that technique. And so I leave you with that particular comment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to pass this along to Kristi.
Thank you, Katie and Bill. So our first discussion topic today is on wetting out. Respondents, depending on where and how they were trained, wet out leather or don't in different degrees and in different areas of the binding using different types of water, deionized, distilled, tap, or rainwater. For example, historically leather was saturated in water and wrung out in the binding process. Today, water is often applied more sparingly, and in some cases, only in specific areas of the binding during the covering process. Next slide, please. We chose this topic because in discussions with leather users, we discerned that training style heavily influences whether and to what degree leather is wet out. Some binders wet leather out thoroughly, while others humidify or only lightly dampen it prior to covering. We were surprised at the varieties of water used in the wetting out process. Our initial assumption was that most users would use deionized or distilled water. When we realized the variety of water sources, we wanted to explore the effects of not just the wetting out, but the source of the water used in the process. Our question to the panelists was, what effect could these different types of wetting out practices and the type of water used have on the longevity of the leather? Next slide.
Hi, my name is Laura Wyrick. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Penn State, and I'm studying the microorganisms that live on leather and how that may pertain to the survival of leather over time. And I'm really happy to answer some questions today. So we're going to tackle question number 1 about wetting out. And so this is really thinking about, in my mind, whether or not leathers are wet, right? And whether or not they involve water. And from a microbial perspective, this is really interesting because we know that different microorganisms live in water that contains different types of nutrients. So for example, water that may have more iron may have different types of microbes than water that has less iron. And so simply by using different types of water from different water sources, types of water meaning, meaning whether that's the well water or creek water or tap water or chlorinated water, we'll have different microorganisms that A, come along with it, and B, may grow well in it. So certainly it might be the details may really be where the good information is at to determine whether or not sort of wetting out leather actually makes a difference.
Water and solvents will have an effect on the leather as they will move loose dyes, oils and tans. Solvents will definitely put oils to the surface, whilst water is more likely to move tannins. If you can dry the leather grain down, then there is less risk of pulling these chemicals to the grain of the skin. Wetting the whole book panel will reduce any chance of chemical or dye movement that could result in tide lines.
Regarding wetting out of leathers, as a tanner and not a conservator or binder, my experience involves taking a hide, tanning it, and then fat liquoring, dyeing, and drying. And at that point, I would say that if the leather does get wet, it will certainly dry stiffer and may need to be mechanically softened or moved in order to give it back some degree of flexibility. You also risk having the loose dyes and any greases or oils or loose tannins in the hide migrate, and that could cause uneven coloration and uneven density of tannins, dyes, and greases. So those might be some issues.
Good afternoon. Water cannot be avoided in connection with leather, where it constitutes an important factor in the maintenance of the properties such as flexibility and reduction of the friction resistance due to movements in the fiber structure. And water is a necessary component in the glue and paste used to bind books. But leather is also very sensitive to moisture and changes in humidity, and water and moisture means chemical and physical reactions, the effect of which increases with increased degradation. This is what I try to illustrate in my answers to the questions. This is a commercial leather, which was wetted, as you can see. And you see the leak out of tannins, as we heard before. And apart from microorganisms, we have different, sometimes very reactive components, chemicals in the tap water, as well as in the rainwater. We have no idea really of how the immediate effect is of water on the leather, apart from what we already saw and heard. But if we look at the deteriorated leather, you will see great, in some cases, a great effect when we immerse it in water. This is a historical leather. And even older leather. And this is an ambient temperature, you can see, and it's just a drop of water and it's gelatinized. The other remark is one which I will come up with during the other presentations, I'm afraid.
Thank you all for your insightful responses to our initial question. So now we're going to move on to the discussion portion for this question and maybe dive into the subject a little bit deeper. One thing that immediately came to mind when hearing your responses is that many binders are trained to wet out leather to prevent uneven staining on the grain side when the flesh side is pasted out in the covering process. So what's your recommendation to avoid this scenario if we shouldn't wet it out or humidify it? Is there perhaps an alternate adhesive or covering method that you think that binders might benefit from using? I won't call on anybody specific, so just jump in if you've got an idea.
Sorry, we cannot see each other. Is that by purpose, or it's just me? It's René speaking.
I think we can see each other a little bit in the sidebar, perhaps. But yes, go ahead.
Well, I think it's I think it's difficult to come up with an alternative to wetting, because when you paste, you have water, but maybe you should leave it by the paste. You anyway need to have the water to penetrate the leather, and before the paste is sticky enough. I think it is. That's my experience as a bookbinder and restorer. That then it's enough to have the leather flexing and get around the book. So I think the extra water should be left out, but I cannot come up with any good alternatives, and because you need some water in the leather when you paste and you want to bind or restore.
So perhaps focusing on the water source is our best course of action in that case.
Yes, I believe that, yeah.
Jesse, did you have something to add? I saw that you unmuted.
Yeah, I had actually more of a question, again, coming from the point of view of the tanner and not the binder or conservator. You know, water is an essential part of the tanning process, but you know, there are lots of discussions and have been for quite a while regarding the types of tannins that are used and whether there's, you know, say catechol or pyrogallol, and what sort of condition that leaves the leather. I would think that, or I would ask if it's, say, a newly tanned piece of leather, one that has not yet degraded by, you know, sort of acidification. If you're going to be trying to do any sort of wetting out of leather, the best time to do it would be when the leather is fairly new and somewhat impervious to the acidification, because the longer that leather sits, especially if it's, say, a catechol type of tannage, it's going to be more you know, susceptible to damage when it does get wet. I mean, Renee was showing the picture of the gelatinization, and that would probably likely happen when the collagen fibers have broken down. So that would be a factor of age more than water. So I mean, that's a theory.
One of the comments.
Absolutely.
Sorry, one of the question and answers that comes up that may relates directly to this is the application of the water to the flesh side rather than the grain side. But I was going to comment that as we look at earlier bindings, shall we say pre 1700 and everything, you know, in many cases those bindings are still in excellent condition. And do we know for a fact, maybe Renee, you know, that was wheat paste always the adhesive that was used, or I understand that in some cases animal glue was used as the adhesive, and would that make it any different when covering a book?
Well, I'm not sure if I know so much about this, but what I can tell is that animal glue needs to be hot, and when it cools down, it stiffens. So if I have to bind a large book, it would be very difficult with animal glue. But another thing is that the heat may have an effect, but I have no evidence concerning the effect or any experience on the difference in the effect of the two types of adhesives, I'm afraid. Again, that could be very nice if someone would take up and do some experiments and maybe use some of the analytical methods which are going to be presented here today to test the effect, the immediate effect.
May I add something?
Yes.
Yeah. From the point of view when you are manufacturing leather, when we make a crust, I'm a little bit hooking in on what Jesse was saying. After you make the crust, to do the mechanics, I'm talking just the dyed leather, not finished, whatever it is, like take the silver calf. Those kinds of leathers, when you use them again for bookbinding, I think, and when you wet them back, or let's say in general, wetting back a crust leather always gives you a different kind of leather afterwards, more loose. So I think that it is very important to be very careful with wetting. I know it's a necessity, but to be very careful what you do, because in those leathers, maybe kind of fillers are used, kind of products are used, which might be partly washed out, or the fibers might be distanced from themselves during the process. So you never get the leather back as it was before. This is what an experience which we see very often, because we work a lot with crust leathers, and they become different after wetting back. Now, with wetting back for bookbinding is different than wetting back as we do in our lab or in the tannery, but there is a substantial difference. Why that is, I also would like to put it here, but it is not only because washing out things, but there are different mechanisms working at the same time, I believe.
I just wanted to jump in. I don't do anything to do with bookbinding whatsoever, but I actually do use hide glue with oil tanned skins. I use it as a way of putting seams together before sewing, and I use it for the reason that it's water soluble. So when I do wash those clothes later on, it does actually wash out. And the hide glue that I make on my own, you don't actually have to have it hot to use it. You warm it up to rehydrate the hide glue, but then it can cool down, and it does get a little bit tackier, but that's about the right consistency where it works well with a porous surface. So I don't know how that would translate to vegetable tan. I do very, very little sewing with veg tan. So that's useful to anyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa. And just to introduce Teresa to our panelists, this is Dr. Teresa Emmerich-Camper, and she is a prehistoric leather skills specialist. So she'll be also joining us for part of the discussions today.
Thank you, and hi, guys.
And to address, I think, one of Jesse's former points about whether we're wetting out historic leather or new leather, typically when we're covering, of course, we're wetting out a new skin, though, as Bill mentioned, sometimes these skins will have been stored for decades before they're actually put on a binding, so that might affect things. And in other cases, sometimes it'll be used not as a wetting out so much, but with the paste in a reback process or something where you're actually putting a new skin next to a historic skin. And many bookbinders have observed the types of deterioration that can occur when the water contacts a historic leather like that.
Can I ask a question?
Hello, did I hear somebody else?
Yeah, that was.
Perhaps a buffered water solution be preferable to just plain water.
I think you're breaking up a little bit, but we are also being joined by Stephen Siegel from Siegel Leathers for the discussion portions. And I think he was just saying perhaps a buffered water solution would be good, which would be great to consider. And I think we actually have just reached the end of our discussion time for this topic. So I'm going to turn it back over to Katie for the next topic of the day. Thank you all.
Thank you, guys. That was really interesting. And thank you, Kristi. Our second topic is pertaining to consolidants. Most respondents of our survey are using Klucel G, which is a hydropropylcellulose, a non-ionic cellulose ether, or SC 7400, which used to be called SC 6000, a blend of waxes and acrylic resin emulsified in propyl alcohol as consolidants. What are the effects of these consolidants on leather longevity? So this session topic arose after several colleagues asked us to investigate possible side effects from the use of the most popular consolidants. In our survey results, about 19% of respondents indicated they prefer not to use any consolidants on leather, choosing instead to rehousing options. And those were the survey results there. And move on to our answers. Here we go.
Ideally, you must test the effect of each component in a mixture before you test the mixture. Therefore, my answer to this question is restricted to the treatment with glucosylgene. Unfortunately, there are no studies published on the long-term effect of the consolidants mentioned in the question. I hope that will be the subject for future research. I choose this formula because that's probably what are mostly used in the workshops. And I tested it on two leathers from a long period test made in UK in the 1930s. So first, you will see that's a sumac leather stored in the British Library. And as you see, it becomes stiffer and shrunken. And now I have made samples by scratching. That's a method which I will present later on. And you will see a drop in coherence of the leather. And a wet fiber test where you see shrunken more hydrofluoric leather fibers. This mimosa leather from the same test. In the first, the dry fibers, coherence 3, and a drop of 0.5. And the fibers stick together. And the wet fiber analysis. And you see far more splitting of fibers and even some gelatinized fibers. You will see examples of gelatinized fibers later in other presentations. And as I think it was David earlier talked about alcohol and stiffening, and that was also what we saw here. And some
So if we're thinking about consolidants and what they may do to leather from a microbial perspective, because again, that's where a lot of my knowledge lies, we really have to think about whether or not these materials are sticky and whether or not they may be antimicrobial in nature. And so things like resins and waxes are known to contain tons of microbial DNA, but we don't necessarily know if there's live microorganisms associated with that. Because we know that it's very sticky, and so it will attract any sort of particles and proteins and DNA, anything from the environment into it. And so for us trying to suss out whether or not these microbes are alive in some of these consolidants and whether or not they're sort of contributing to the degradation of leather is quite difficult. What's even more fascinating though is how microbes may utilize some of those consolidants in ways that may support or inhibit degradation over time. So some microbes may sort of live on the surface of the wax and actually serve as a sort of secondary barrier, right, to new microorganisms coming in that may eventually degrade. So certainly lots to think about in this space.
Again, as a tanner, I don't really have too much experience regarding consolidants on leather. Our job is to try to make the leather and make it well the first time around so that there is no need for consolidant of disintegrating leather later on.
Great. Thank you, guys. That was really interesting. Consolidants, it seems to me, Renee, you mentioned this, there are no studies done on the long-term effects of consolidants. Given
Sorry, not that particular one.
no,
There's a few one. Aluminium alkoxide has been tested.
Okay.
Some years ago, but it's the only one I know about. Probably maybe some of the Leather Conservation Center. More recent consolidants have been tested, but I haven't had time to go into to study the literature on that. But it's very, very, very little which have been done in this area.
In lieu of that, what is our best course of action as a result? Is it really no action, or?
Well, again, that's one of the problems. If you are facing a problem like what you are looking at right now on the screen, where the books or the leather is falling apart from the books, what should you do then? Well, one thing you must be aware is that you have tested consolidants on an effect of different treatment on paper and a few on leather, as I said. You may have the leather to, so to speak, glue together, but if you test it physically, you don't have any real improvement of the physical strength of the leather. But if you just leave the books like this, you have a problem because it continues to disintegrate. You may slow down the disintegration for some years by using a consolidant, but we need more research and tests to be sure if it's really a good long-term, a good idea on the long term. Also, if it's possible to find any consolidants, including the solvents you are using, because that's also a problem. I think in some cases the solvents may do more harm than consolidants, but that's another question. Yeah. So I'm afraid no miraculous cure from my point of view.
Yeah, and that's interesting that the solvents actually could cause more damage than the consolidant that's left behind after the solvents evaporate. That's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, in my experience, it's a very short-term solution that over time the consolidants wear away. It's not a long-term solution.
And I think to add to that, Katie, as well, is it's not a long-term solution, but also how does it affect the integrity of the leather long-term, right? Are you speeding up that process over the next 100 years by using a consolidant, or are you actually sort of slowing it down? It's like, what do you do immediately, or what do these chemicals do immediately to the leather, and how might they be integrated? But also like 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years later, right? What do these also then have an effect on? And so I think for me, it's like we're asking two questions. It's like, does it help right now versus is it going to help 100 years from now? And I'm trying to tease those two apart. Are really tricky, but I think that there is a lot of really good research that can be done in this space using historical leathers, right? We can be using a lot of sort of mass spec based tools to try to tease back what was used, and we can also sort of then do a lot of the work that Renee's been doing and some of the DNA work we've been doing to try to figure out, okay, well, what's driving the degradation, and is this a chemical process? This is a biological process. What exactly is going on here? Really taking these historical leathers and looking in real time at experiments that have already been ran, right? That somebody didn't know was an experiment.
Unintentional experiments.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to how they were originally tanned, the level of degradation. And there is not always a rhyme or reason to it. We have found that a lot of the older leather that was tanned, 200-300 years ago is in better shape than modern leather, which is also a reason we started this group. So sort of getting the best leather we can so that it won't degrade is really the goal.
Yeah, I guess I do look at quite a lot of old leather, a lot older than what we're talking about here, including things that are 6,000–7,000 years old, up to as recent as, say, the Viking period, so maybe 1,000 years. And one of the things that I've seen consistently over and over as from a conservation standpoint is the least amount of work that's been done on them, those bits of leather tend to be in much better shape. And with some of the stuff that I've been looking at in Israel, they do have pictures of a lot of it from when it was pulled out of the ground. And now we look at it today, and there's been a distinctive breakdown on some of the items that have had consolidation agents put on them. But when it comes to fat tans or oil tans, I think polyethylene glycol is my nightmare. It just makes everything so black and so sticky. I almost can't analyze the piece visually any longer. Just a bit from my perspective, like I said, I don't deal with books. I've never been brought in and asked to look at books, but.
Well, we appreciate your perspective because that's where we're trying to bring in, you know, obviously people that are not just books, and you're looking at the really, really old leather and seeing that those effects over time. So that's terrific. Thank you, Teresa.
Sure, it is kind of interesting because a lot of times you end up seeing a pretty wide range of conservation techniques that have been used, because you are looking at stuff that has been conserved 100 years ago or 120 years ago, even in some of the older collections.
Yeah, we can track that in books as well. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I'll bet. And it has gotten a lot better, I'll say that.
It's been a lot less invasive, I'd say.
Yes, absolutely. I haven't seen any plasticized shoes that, yeah, I've actually seen one of those at one point from about, I think it was done in the 20s or 30s. It's probably the worst case of an invasive intervention I've seen.
Can I just add a comment? I think it was Peter who said that you should put a date on things, and in this case, I just want to suggest that people are going back, if you have done any consolidations, going back to make a review of how does the leather looks today. And in the future, if you have to do consolidation, please make a report and come back from time to time to follow what goes on with the leather. I think there's a lot of experience lying out in our storage facilities. I will turn back to that in one of the next of my presentations here.
Thank you, Renee. Does anybody else have anything to add? If not, we can move on. We have our first video presentation. Well, thank you all. That was wonderful. Renee has offered up 2 videos for us. This is the first of the 2. This is how to measure the fiber coherence of vegetable tanned leather. And it will run.
The fiber coherence test is a simple but effective method for measuring the physical strength and coherence of the dry leather structure. Our video is produced as a guide in performing the analysis using tools that make it easy to document and interpret the results achieved. Finally, we advise on how you train and achieve routine in performing the test, and at the same time, create your own coherence scale. Sorry, I was muted. I will present first some general background for the method. You probably all know how the leather may degrade into what you in some cases call red rot, which looks like if you scratch the leather, you will have small pin-like fragments or a powder-like bunch of fragments. And this disintegration you can categorize into 5 degrees of damage. And you can even choose or see damage which lies in between the 5 degrees. We will see examples of this later on. In this paper, you will see the method used to test the influence of mass deacidification on book bindings. And here are the results. And the red bars are the fiber covariance. And some correlated data with the percent sulfate and the pH value. It's a Tanner's pocketbook, Old Danish Tanner's pocketbook. When you're using the scalpel, you have to be very careful not to cut, but just scratch very gently and careful. And always with the same strength. This is again the Tanner's pocketbook, very easy to scratch a small sample. This is more or less the size of the sample you need to scratch. And of course, there are restrictions on where you can scratch from an item, but it's obvious to scratch there where you have the corium fibers already present. So there you have the sample. And please report when you do, if it's very difficult up to easy to release the fibers, or if you find they are attracting to each other, or if they are non-attractive. And here are examples of the sumac and mimosa leathers from the long period storage test in UK. These 2 books were stored at the British Library in around 1932, I think, or 33. And they have been tested in the step leather and environment leather projects. First, we look at the sumac tanned leather, which is a hydrolyzable type of tanning. So, scratching very carefully. I always use a rounded scalpel blade if they are what do you call it? They should not be needle formed. I have to find another way, because then you cut too easy. And you see the sample. This is mimosa tanned leather. I have scratched more or less on the same areas of the two leathers to be easy to, or to have a relative comparison among them. We have found that normally if you are within an area of 2 square centimeters of the same leather, you will have a good or relatively good possibility to compare. Then under the microscope here, I'm using a Dinolight USB camera or microscope, which is relatively inexpensive. That's another thing, you don't have to use a very expensive setup. And here you have the coherence scale from 1 to 5. It's 5 as the worst situation. The sumac tan, I give a score of 2, whereas the mimosa tan will have a score of 4.5, lying between the 4th and 5th score. I think it comes up twice, sorry. Too many videos on production. Now it should be easier to see that we lie between 1 and 3 here. And for the mimosa tan, between 4 and 5. And this is how we prepare our report from. You have the coherence, description of the leathers, and then how I felt it appeared during scratching. Another thing is also, it's good to report the color of the leather and other interesting observations. And now how we can train and set up your own coherence scale. So that's the way to do it. And when you have the routine, it's quite quick to do the test, I would say. We have used the test also on archaeological leathers. This is a second, no, the one on the Wagner, Iron Age and Wagner Age leathers. And of course, we used the test in the new leather production project that Steve, Eric, and I are working on.
Great. Thank you so much, Renee. That was terrific. We're going to move on now to topic 3. If I can get the slide to go the right way. And I'm going to hand it over to Holly.
Thank you, Katie. As we've heard, respondents are using different types of alcohol, denatured alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, and ethanol at different strengths in the mixing of some of the consolidant and dye recipes. What is the effect of the different alcohols on leather longevity? So historically, alcohols have been used in numerous times during treatments. And leather users add alcohol to increase solubility so dyes bond to leather. Yet it's unclear how this interacts with the skin. Leather users have heard from tanners that alcohol will harm the leather because moisture is pulled from the skin. Are leather users creating long-term problems? Some tanners have recommended rehydrating with oil. So now we're going to hear from David Lanning.
As with wetting out, The use of alcohol can cause loose dyes in the leather to move to the surface. It can also draw out the oils in the skin, leaving the leather feeling dry and hard to the touch.
The studies in fiber morphology is, as you see, observing fiber samples in water under the microscope. We know a lot about how historical parchment reacts in water after they have been treated with water or different alcohols. And in the worst case you see in the below right corner with isopropanol, where you have the fibers completely gelatinized. I had performed the experiment with mimosa tan leather. That's one from the British long period trial, and tested with water, ethanol, propane, 2, and denaturized ethanol. And you see the fibers. The most effect you will see is on the propane 2O and denaturized ethanol. But in all cases, you have an effect on the fibers. And we have, doing a study of parchment,
Regarding usage of alcohol on the leather, during the tanning, fat liquoring, dyeing process, basically the entire process that we would handle here at Pergamena, we don't use alcohol at any point in the process. So it is not the solvent that we use during our processing. All our processes are water-based. I would be concerned that usage of alcohol later on would cause dyes and fat liquors to migrate and get washed out of the skin, which could lead to long-term fragility of the leather.
Question number 3 is thinking about alcohol and its use on leather. From my perspective, alcohol is really interesting, right? Because it's very antimicrobial, but only for a short amount of time. And in fact, many of the microbes that we find on leather may actually be protective and preventing other microbes from coming in. You know, you kind of have to think about it being a little microbial war, right? There's some microbes that live on the leather, they're very happy there, they don't want other microbes to come in. And so if alcohols are used on the leather, it could kill those sort of microbes. And then you'd have to be really careful about what are the new microbes that are coming in, right? Are they ones that may also support the health of the leather, or are they ones that may be associated with more rapid degradation of the leather? And so in my mind, it's really interesting to think about that independently. Mixing them into consolidants and things like that may have a very, sort of minimal effect probably on the microbes, but in general, thinking about alcohol and leathers for treatments can be quite interesting.
So as we've heard, no one feels that alcohol is beneficial to leather. Can you give us some alternatives, please? Panelists?
No, sorry. That's again like an issue for further research. But I think we are dealing with a material which is so reactive in a way. We have a mixture of tannins, oils. The collagen itself is very reactive, and so I can't see any alternative. And we know from the study of parchment, that's what I've tried to say before. We have studied, for instance, the whole Doomsday book. I have studied also the Codex Sinaiticus, and the Codex Sinaiticus, the London volume, has been treated more gently than the volumes of the Doomsday book. And in the Doomsday book, we can immediately see that when compared to old reports on the condition, and also by studying the repair areas, that in few decades you have a gelatinization of the collagen because it was wetted by water. And I'm afraid that using alcohol, where you have an immediate effect, will be even worse. When you have started the process of gelatinization, it seems as it carries on. So unfortunately, I can't see any alternative at the moment.
May I add something?
Sure.
Can I add something?
To Renee, I mean, to Ray, let's say generally to the panel, two things. I think alcohols is a very, widely a word used for a big group of things. I think we should define a little bit better what kind of alcohols we use in, because in leather making, especially in finishing, we use a lot of different kinds of alcohols, penetrators, dyeing, help, assistance, this kind of thing, and fatty alcohols, long-chain alcohols, etc. So I think those two things we need to define a little bit better, or not, because fatty alcohols are used in leather making, and the alcohols like you are here discussing are used in the finishing of leather, even when it is new, not when it is old, but when it is new, in order to get get some penetration of dye stuff or seasoning coat or whatever. So just want to add this to the panel.
Can I ask a question here? I don't know how to.
Sure, Stephen.
Well, maybe the panel should first answer and then.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Renee, you want to add? Oh, you're muted.
Can I add something very quickly? Just tell me when I can add something. I don't know.
I think Steve before me.
Okay, Steve, you want to go?
Yeah, I just want to make a suggestion. Maybe this would be a good question for Eric. How about using an oil soap as a solvent? It won't harm the leather. It's a good solvent.
Sorry, can you repeat the question and articulate, because I didn't get it?
I use an oil soap.
I don't hear you. It's very garbled. Your connection is bad.
He said use an oil soap.
Yes.
And what's your opinion on using an oil soap?
I was talking in general terms, not in specific terms. Leather making is not only with oil soaps, but it is a very big room. Yes, we can use them too.
No, but use an oil soap as a solvent when you need to get something into the leather, as opposed to using alcohol or something like that. Use an oil soap as an alternative to alcohol. Alcohol strips the leather. Oil soap does not.
Well, in fat liquors, there are acetates, EPA, isopropyl alcohols are used like stabilizer, like penetrating agents. The stabilizer of the product itself, it's used.
Maybe I'm not.
Renee, do you want to add something?
Of course, there's a difference between when you produce a leather. My remarks is concerning after we have got the produced leathers are booked, either as bookbinders or conservators. And when the leather gets older, its properties are very different from new leathers. And the reactions of when you put in things in a relative old or older leather is very different. And what I would be very careful with is to put in something which like soaps or anything other containing salts which can bloom out on the surface and spoil the surface. We know that from potassium lactate treatments. So my advice is, if you think you have an alternative, test it on new leather, test it on old leather. You can also do accelerated aging. I have suggestions for that in one of my my presentations. So you shouldn't test anything new on cultural heritage items before you have tested it really well, I would say. So I can't come up with any alternative. The only thing I can say at the moment is keep your hands in the pockets. Sorry.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we can move on now to dyes. Katie?
We could address one question in the chat
Okay.
about alcohol. Are there considerations for using alcohols on non-mechanical versus mechanical components of book structures, i.e. leather over joints versus leather over boards? Thinking about consolidants and maintaining functionality and access.
Well, again, we have the problem of what to do when you have to work in real life. So I think it's very urgent to come up with some research on these areas. But I'm afraid that the things that I have tasted, alcohol especially, but also the water, when it comes to parchment and this pilot test that I did, it seems to be relatively the same leather. They are damaging and they probably accelerate the degradation of the leather. So yeah, I don't know if that was the answer to your question, Katie.
Well, that's a start. I just thought I would take something from the Q&A box. That was really helpful.
And here's, sorry, Katie.
Go ahead.
There is a second one that relates to alcohol as well, and kind of combines with our previous topic, consolidants. Do the effects of consolidants with alcohol affect the whole thickness of the leather or just the top layer where it's applied?
Well, my test was on the corium fibers. So at least I haven't tested if the Crucial G went into the corium fibers. They may stay more or less on the top or in the grain layer. But the alcohol goes through the whole structure of the leather and it damages the corium fibers. So probably the fibers in the grain layer is even more damaged than because they are in the first hand more degraded than corium fibers. Degradation starts from outside in. So the damage is probably greater on the grain layer than in the corium.
Thank you, Renee. That makes sense. I'm glad we could fit in a couple of questions from the panelists. Stephen, did you have something to add before we move on?
No, I'm okay.
Okay. Well, then we'll move on to the next topic, which is dyes. So in our survey, over half of the US respondents prefer pre-dyed skins, whereas only a third of respondents outside the US preferred pre-dyed. Overall, a third of respondents dye skins in-house. In the US, respondents are more varied in their dye choices, whereas outside the US, the majority of respondents use Hewitt's or Rhoda dyes. When skins are dyed in-house using either alcohol or water-based dyes, what effect do these dyes have on leather? How do dye fixatives affect the leather? And this is actually interesting to us because the leather discussion group actually started with a discussion about dyes. So this is sort of a topic near and dear to our heart. Dyeing skins can be very finicky and tricky and yield less than desirable results, shall we say. I'll move on to, oops. This is a short presentation that Renee put together about dyeing.
Yeah.
Oops.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Okay, it's all right. Start again. Nope, it's not letting me do it. Hang on, Renee. Almost has to be a technical issue, doesn't there?
It's a co-production video.
There you go. Here we go. Now it's running.
Yeah, I think that's from an Egyptian dye store. This is basic aniline dye, which I think that was the first movie was missing, but okay. If you had to choose, or if I had to choose, that would be the one with the right pH range. Acid aniline dyes, you should be careful with because it contains sulfur and nitrogen dioxide groups. And you have direct or substantive dyes. Which, well, in all cases, these dyes are aromatic compounds, which can be quite reactive. And we don't know the long-term effect of these, but and it's a really complex problem to the dye production is large and it's very much directed by the fashion industry. And my experience from years ago was that it became very difficult to have the old aniline dyes. It changed from water-based into alcohol-based dyes that we could get hold of. So, but I think my first video was missing.
There was okay, I didn't see the first slide, you mean?
Yeah, but there are two. There was the original video and this was the additional one.
Okay. Well, we have the answer.
Probably after David's, I think.
Okay. Well, let's go to the answers of the questions and then we can.
As far as dyeing leather is concerned, we have seen many beautiful bindings where natural leather has been dyed to strong colours. As well as the possible movement of chemicals and tannins within the skin, there is also the risk that the dyes will bronze, look metallic, if dyeing to a darker shade. This is caused by the dyes forming a lake on the surface. It can be remedied to a degree by wiping over with milk, which contains casein. This is not the case with acrylic pigments, which bind to the surface of the leather. In the case of general bindings for repair and conservation work, we would generally recommend using a skin that has been dyed close to the shade that you require and then tinting down to the correct shade, rather than starting from a natural undyed leather. By doing this, you will only need to wet the leather once or twice, rather than multiple times. The risk of bronzing is largely removed, and in addition, you would potentially not need to be using any dye fixatives. We only started selling dye fixatives after the Leather Conservation Centre in Northampton, England started to do so in the early 2000s. These products work very well at fixing dyes, but they are designed to be used in processed drums rather than by hand. They are very active and will bind any loose chemicals to the skin. We tried using them as a way to get deep blacks onto our calf. They certainly did the job well, but we decided not to use them as dye fixatives because they change the character of the leather, making the skin spongy with a greasy surface. We do not know whether the Leather Conservation Centre ever did any research on the effects fixatives had on the leather for hand applications.
Thinking about dyes in the context of leather is actually incredibly interesting, and this is for multiple reasons. The first one is that dyes can actually be selective for particular types of microbes. Again, like we see with water, some microbes will do well with dyes with certain nutrients in them, right? Whereas other maybe more synthetic dyes may be more antimicrobial, and so certain microbes may not do well on the sort of dyes or in the addition of dyes. And so dyes have also been shown in the literature to kind of select for different types of microbes. In fact, you can use dyes as part of your selective media to try to, really distinguish between different genera or different species of microbes. And so it's can be really important in the selection of the kinds of microbes that you might want to associate on leather. Thinking about dyes and leather from another perspective, it's also interesting to think about its degradation. And so the way we think about dyes in the environment is really about how certain natural microbes may be able to break down dyes and whether or not they're more environmentally friendly. We can really apply those same principles onto leather and think about, are there certain dyes that are broken down by microbes more rapidly, or are there certain dyes that may actually provide some resistance to microbial degradation, in which case that may provide protection for the leather over a long period of time. Again, a lot of this research has not yet been done, which is why we're here and why we're looking into it. But dyes are certainly something that we need to pay attention to when we're thinking about what's controlling the microbial communities that we see on the leather.
Okay, that's my presentation. But it was okay to have the other one first because you saw examples of some of the dyes that I will speak. This is a very big question in the sense that dyes include many different compounds, and new ones are constantly being developed. In addition, there are fixatives and other chemical compounds that may have been added to the colors. My advice is to stick to the classics, such as aniline dyes, and investigate the long-term effect through observations and experiments. Yeah. Again, an area to be looked into. And these are examples of what we saw before, that you will have some molecules which contains reactive groups, which you should avoid. You could follow my example on how I tested the effect of alcohol, and then the long-term effect by accelerated aging. That's the methods we are using in the leather development project, which gives quite good insight to how the leather may behave in the long term.
As far as dyes go, all our dyes that we use here are water-based dyes, aniline dyes, and all the dyeing that we do on our leathers is, excuse me, drum dyed, which means that the hides are put in a drum and dyed in a water bath. The leather can sometimes be finished afterwards, which means that dyes or pigments could be sprayed on the leather, and that could involve finishes, waxes, resins, polyurethane finishes, any number of things, although most of those are discouraged, especially for binding and conservation leathers. The less chemicals, the better for long-term viability. I will also say that when dyeing, we use formic acid as a fixative on the leathers. That does tend to, as a mordant, it brings the pH down and helps to fix the leather or fix the dye to the leather. It also lowers the pH, and the pH of the leather usually ends up being somewhere in the 4 to 5 range, but not too much different than what a veg tan skin pH would be without dye.
Great. Thank you all for your answers there. What I'm hearing is that water-based dyes are preferred and it cause less damage to the leather, but wetting out of leather is also problematic. What are the best options for binders who need to tone leather?
Without being 100% in my assumptions, I think still I would use a water-based dye, but again, it needs to be tested. But I believe that the alcohols you would use, for instance, ethanol or isopropyl alcohol or propane 2-ol, which is the same, they seem to have a more drastic effect on the collagen. But this was tested out on historical leather. I haven't tested it on new leather, and I think that the effect may be otherwise, but the long-term effect we don't know about. So that's up for testing and observation. So remember to observe, record what you are doing, and observe and try to come back to what you have made or produced. Go back to the storage facilities and look at your books or the items and see if you see changes after 1, 2, 5, 10 years and so on. Yeah.
Thank you, Renee. You also mentioned the health concerns, and that is also something that came up in our survey and that we've discussed amongst ourselves, that some of these dyes have highly toxic components to them. And
yeah, that's right. That's right. They may be unhealthy to us. It's also David sent us some description of the dyes they're using, and there are some health precautions. But we also have to think of nature. Some of the leather, some of the remains of the dyestuffs may end up in nature. So those dyes containing aluminium or other metal, for instance, or if you're using chrome or whatever, should be avoided. But you may also have an effect, because I am afraid that some of the dyes may have a hormone-like effect on living species in nature. We have already seen that some chemical compounds, which you would never have expected have this effect, really have had a large effect on human babies, on deformed animals you find in nature. So we really have to be careful what we are doing, I must say.
We do have a question in the chat. This is more geared towards Jesse or Eric, perhaps. Are there any resources that list water-soluble dyes currently available on the market? Are there skins that Jesse or David recommend for modifying with water-soluble dyes, both pre-dyed and undyed?
Not sure when you say modified, what exactly that means, but
I think they're asking which skins would take those dyes. Are there certain skins that would take the dyes better than others?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. All I can speak to is just the hides that we are tanning here, and that is partly affected by the type of tannage that we're doing, and we do use different blends of veg tans depending on what product it is. So for archival leathers, specifically for bookbinding, we're using basically a chestnut tannin, versus if we are doing some other like fashion leathers or furniture or leather goods, we might use a combination of chestnut and mimosa ME. So the dyes will, given the base color of the tannage, it will affect the appearance of the dye. The other thing is, one other thing I thought to mention before was talking about long-term stability maybe of the dye. That could also be affected by the base color of the tannage, and the tannage itself is reactive to changes or reactive to light. So that's one of the drawbacks sometimes of veg tanning, is that it will fade with too much exposure to sunlight or UV light, and that will definitely cause colors to fade and cause the dyes to break down. Another thing, like the difference between a dye and a pigment, which is something to consider, is a dye is a chemical versus a pigment, which is a particle of something. A dye as a chemical, once it gets exposed to, say, light, for instance, the dye can break down, and as a result will fade and disappear. A pigment being a particle, it will only it will only ever get as small as that molecule of pigment will get, and as a result, that isn't really, you're not really going to have fading so much from the pigment.
That makes sense.
That's all I would have to add.
We had a question earlier that sort of ties in with this. Can you go into a little bit more detail about the two types of tannins? You mentioned pyrogallo and catechol.
Well, I definitely backfilled my knowledge with this stuff. Probably Renee or Eric would be better suited to answer this, but I will say that the catechol is that's more of that's the non-archival, whereas the pyrogallo is the archival version. And the catechol is very hydrolyzable, very easily hydrolyzable, and as a result, pollutants from the air, usually sulfuric acid compounds. I mean, this is probably something most people here already know, but there, as a result of combination with pollutants in the air, it tends to break down much more easily, and you end up with things like red rot going on. Pyrogallo is less easily hydrolyzable, and therefore it's more stable. From an archival point of view, there are different, those two classes. There are certainly different tannins in each class, like mimosa and cabracho, for instance, would be some of the more common tannins in the catechol category versus something like chestnut or sumac, and sometimes oak, although oak has sometimes both tannins in it. But for purposes of archival quality, we usually stick with sumac or chestnut. So, but again, I'm sure Renee and Eric have much more information regarding that.
I see both of their hands up, so we'll go to Renee first and then Eric.
Okay, I will continue where Jesse stopped. That's right. When you have condensed tannins, you have a tannin which is far more prone to it sucks up SO2 and other things from the air and gets acid, but it's also a very strong antioxidant, and that's the purpose of the tannins in nature, to protect from oxidation. But when these compounds are oxidized, they become oxidizing themselves. And the same is, I'm afraid, with the dyes, that they when they fade, it's because of oxidation, and that means that we will see the color disappears, but the chemical compound is staying in the leather, and it may oxidize the tannins and the collagen and help to degrade furthermore than we wanted to happen. Yeah.
Thank you, Renee. Eric, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I want to hook in on what Jesse said before, partly Renee. I think it's very interesting just to add here that we are trying to do, let's say, accelerated aging with Renee and with Stephen. So we will make studies on fresh leather, climate chamber aged leather, and then also climate chamber aged plus oxidized leather in the oven by 120 degrees. So like a double whammy. And this kind of things, Renee will do also the fiber studies and the discoloration of the thing. So to actually to confirm what Jesse was saying, you have even if you use pyrogalolic tannins, which you are trying to use, chestnut is one of them. It depends a little bit what kind of chestnut you are using, but we are also using in our calf, all these pyrogalolic tannins, and they have a much better resistance against aging or hydrolyzation, and this is shown also in the leather. But we will come back later to that. To the leather dyeing or the leather of the dyeing itself of leather, I just want to add an important point. It is the affinity of the substrate which you're dealing with. So if you have a full chrome leather, then when you dye with metal complex dyes, you have a great affinity. They dye well. But with the same dyes or acid dyes or whatever, I dye vegetable tanned leather, I get a very pale shade. So the best thing would be theoretically to dye with basic dyes to vegetable leather. So it's a pH question, an affinity of the substrate to the dyes, which is very important for the selection of the dyes. The top dyes would be, but that it would be, let's say, impossible. That would be then silver dyes. There's another group, but they are very complicated to use, but they have a very high light resistance. But the point is that they are very difficult to deal with. The only known one, which is used in the leather industry, is silver black 1, which is combined with acid black 210 to make the penetration through the leather for chrome leathers, that you get a nice black cut. Because the cuts are also important, not only the grain or the flesh side, but the cuts as well. So these kind of combinations are used. It depends, again, the substrates, what you're using, the selection of dyes, and the color of the substrate itself, like Jesse was correctly pointing out. And for the rest, I think Renee has some homework just received, so we will get back to about that soon later.
Terrific. We had one quick question, and then we are going to go to break for 15 minutes. There was a question in the chat about the possible use of diluted acrylic paint. How do you guys feel about that? Would that be an option, or would that not stay on the surface of the leather? It wouldn't penetrate the leather, perhaps?
Sorry, could you?
Should I repeat it? It says, in regards to light fastness and leather degradation, what are thoughts on the use of applying diluted acrylic paint, such as fluid acrylics?
I would be very careful, I think. But again, it's not tested. But it has a kind of solvent, which I don't know, is maybe water-based or whatever. But acrylics are relatively stable, but only relatively. So I don't know. It has to be tested.
All right, we've promised everybody 15-minute break, so we're going to take that now. We'll come back at, let's see, a little bit after 11:30, 11:32. Okay. See you in a second. Thank you so much. 2 more minutes and then we'll start up again. And Renee will lead with your micro hot table video.
Yeah, and maybe you can, when I speak about special things to look on, I try to say where on the screen we are. Maybe you can point with.
You can try. My best shot. We have 11:31. 1 more minute, and then we'll. Okay, I'm showing our 15 minutes is up. So thank you. I hope everybody had a nice break. We are going to lead, we have 2 more topics to cover, but we're going to start this part of the next part of the session, the panel, with a video that Renee kindly put together. It is about 29 minutes, 27 minutes, and he's going to narrate throughout. It is how to measure the hydrothermal stability of vegetable tan leather, also known as the micro hot table process, or MHT process. So without further ado, I will start the video.
Thank you. Measurement of the hydrothermal stability using the micro hot table method is well documented and widespread among colleagues around the world, which is confirmed by the number of publications which include the use of the method. However, we would like the method to be more widely used, as it is relatively easy to perform and it provides a lot of important information about the quality and condition of the leather and other skin-based materials, which you cannot obtain with other methods. Therefore, we have aimed to design this video as a do-it-yourself guide on how to prepare the sample for measurement, perform the measurement, and process and present the results. The recordings contain various interesting phenomena that may emerge during the shrinkage process, depending on the condition of the leather. And we have chosen to show recordings which contain some small trivial problems that may arise during the recording of the shrinkage process, but which have no influence on the possibility to measure or on the measurement results. Well, you probably all have heard about the standard method. And, well, one of our students took up the challenge to test a very simple equipment setup to tell there's no excuse for small workshop not to do at least a measurement of the shrinkage temperature. And it showed up that she was quite capable to have a very correct measurement of the shrinkage temperature of different skin and leather items, as you can see here. It's compared to the micro hot table method. So it's strongly significant. But if you need more information, you should use the either the micro hot table method or differential scanning calorimetric method. And again, you have a good correlation between the methods. You can see some deviations of with the differential scanning calorimetric method. That was due to using a too high speed of heating. And here you see how the shrinkage proceeds through different intervals. It can be visualized in this way, the A1, some few shrinkage with pauses, and then B2, the shrinkage accelerates into the main interval, C interval. The start of the C interval is what we define as the shrinkage temperature. These are some examples of leathers and skins which we have reported on, and this is the way we do it in a graphical way. We will turn back to this. And some of the important information you will get by using these methods. And again, there's very little sample you need for doing the method. And you can use the same sample as, for instance, if you do the coherence test, you can transfer the fibers to the microscope slide and prepare them for the shrinkage process, as you see here. Also on the sample, or next to the sample. Dorte, my cooperator, is now trying very carefully to divide the fibers into individual as much as possible. Nice, and yeah. And when they are ready, you put on the cover slip. And this is the hot table. Unfortunately, it's not built for the type of slides that we are using, so we had to cut the glass, as you probably saw before. Starting. Normally start around room temperature, and also always using a scan rate of 2 degrees C per minute, like the standard method in the leather industry is defining. Lower than well, if it's gelatinized at room temperature or shrink at room temperature, then you have to cool down the hot table. And again, it's the two leathers, the Mimosa and the Sumac leathers, and we have taken the sample from the same area as we did for the coherence test. First, I will show you the first shrinkage, which will take place at around 46.6 degrees. And you see up on the left, that was the first. And we are now in the A1 interval. So that means that we will see one shrinkage event at the time, and then a break, and then another event. But you have to observe the whole picture all the time, because it can be a very thin fiber in the background. Then we went we go on into the B1, where one shrinkage, you saw one there, 61.3. And there's another one. Sometimes there an overlap. The shrinkage activity, unless you have a new leather, is rather low in the first intervals. So you have to observe very carefully. But the advantage of the video method is that you can scroll forward and back and be sure that you have hit the right event. Normally you also have to, because there you had another shrinkage in upper left corner. Normally we will focus the microscope more than you see here, but it's not to confuse the picture too much. We only did it a few times. Another shrinkage. Now you have we are still in the B1. So now we will see how we enter the C interval, report there you have. We are still in the B. Oh, now we have entered the C interval. You see more fibers shrinkage at the time. In the lower left, the two thin fibers are shrinking. And you have another beneath, and now another of the thin fibers. And you're up in the middle of the picture, you have shrinkage. So if you're thinking of the differential scaling calorimetric graph, we are in the high peak of the graph. And the shrinkage goes on and the activity increase. Here the shrinkage interval is rather long, so we have cut the film into two, so you will see up to around the height, the highest point of the shrinkage peak or shrinkage activity peak, and then the next part will be the end of the C interval. But you can see that the shrinkage activity is now quite high. Fibers are deforming. Some of them are unwinding. And sitting after the third and fourth film, you begin to see very funny little creatures appearing. It can be very interesting and informative because it tells you on the condition of the fibers. And those fibers which are, you still see some long, narrow fibers which are those in the best condition, and that's also those who will shrink at the highest temperatures. So you get an idea of variation in physical strength. And now you will see, this is the end of the C interval. You can see awful lot have happened already. There's only a few long fibers, which looks relatively intact left. So the B2 should be around 85.9 degrees C, so it takes a little time. And now that's an interesting phenomenon. This is not something from outer space turning up, it's an air bubble. And we choose to let it be because sometimes you cannot get all air out, and when the fibers are squeezing, you may have air bubbles coming in. But this air bubble don't interfere with the process and have no effect on the results, so we kept it. But sometimes you have to do it all over again, unfortunately, when too many bubbles comes in and pushes the fibers around, then it can be very difficult to see the shrinking. It turns out well. You have a funny phenomenon because some of the fibers would appear in the front, in the middle of where you have the light area of the air bubble, looking like little people keep looking out of the bubble. So still around 2 minutes left before we reach the end of the C interval. But it shows you how strong the shrinkage of the fibers are. So when you have come so far, there's no return back to the original structure. And sometimes you will see that happens at room temperature. Those who have restored historical leathers maybe seen the leather becoming very black and strong, typically in the edges of the leather. That's another problem, that the fibers are sometimes coming or gliding out inside the microscope. The problem is to get microscope slides which are matching the hole in the micro-hot table. We haven't been able to have any factories to produce a microscope slide which fits the micro-hot table. So now we slowly move forwards to the end of the C interval. As I said, it was 85.9 degrees C. You can see if you agree with me when it's around that temperature. We still had 2, 3 events taking place at the same time, which is the definition of the C interval. And now it should stop. That should be now we should have entered the B1 interval. You can see there's a little stop, but now they are not simultaneous anymore. So now we are in the B2, and we will see the end of the B2 and start of the A2 interval, which is at 6.8 degrees C. You see there's a little movement in the down left, down right corner, and some movement in, sorry, it's ended here. That was the last. I don't know why this picture, but okay. Now it's the mimosa, and this is a completely other story. We have these very fragmented fibers, only very little parts of intact fibers left, and we have the first shrinkage around 40. We have just got into the A1 interval. But here the shrinkage activity is very low, so we have to be very observable to see when shrinkage takes place. Now we have one in the middle of to the right. Another one, yeah, that's right. And now we enter the B1 interval at 47.6. That's the one to the in the middle of the right. Also one of the first we saw in the B1 interval. And now another one up there. And you may have breaks in between, but we enter the C interval, very short interval of B1. It should be at 48.9. So now you have two simultaneously and more. So we have an increased activity. And in a short while, you will see the beginning of a drastic transformation of the fibers. You can see the one which is moving downwards. This is curling very much. And the bigger one, just in the middle of the picture, a little to the left. In the top, oh, sorry, we continue because there was no A2, so it's just the B2 interval which continues. And what you will see now is a transformation into dissolution of the fibers into a gel-like substance. So the fibers completely lose the structure and are more or less dissolved. You see on the upper left corner, there's a small rounded piece, which is yeah, that one. this gel. And if you go close to the middle up, this one, yes, correct. There you have a nicely, sorry for the expression, but it's slowly dissolves into a gel. And it just becomes worse. And it goes up to 83.7 when we stopped, when we couldn't see any activity anymore. But this is a kind of looking into the future, because what we really is doing here is kind of accelerated aging. Yeah, now I split, so we went up to 82, and you certainly can see that the fiber structure is, there's only a few little fibers around which are still more or less intact, but they slowly also are dissolving. And using other methods, you won't see this. So it's just a confirmation that one of the most important tools of a conservator is your eye. So that's why I really like this method. Then how to treat the data. I can send you the spreadsheets with all these examples that you see here. You just use the email written in red, and I will send you. And you can just put in your own figures and have the graphs out. So that's the results. And that's, if we wanted to publish, we would do it like this. And as we took the samples from the same area as we did the coherence test, I put the remarks and also the results of that together with the shrinkage temperature results, and they matches very well. And some of our publications on the method. And in those you will find, of course, references to other of our colleagues who use the method. And thanks to Kathleen Mühlen-Axelsson, who had her equipment in Sweden that we could borrow for this video. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Renee, for traveling to make this video for this presentation. We really appreciate it.
It was nice to do it again. So we had a good time over there. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are going to move ahead so we can keep on time and still have time for questions at the end. I'm going to hand it over to Holly, who's going to take over with the pairing and thickness portion. Not sure why that slide went ahead. Hang on, I'm trying to get back, Holly. There we go.
Okay. In the covering process, a third of the respondents that answered our survey edge pair only, while others send skins out for overall thinning to approximately 0.5 millimeters. A smaller percentage purchase skins at the desired thickness with no additional pairing. The smallest number of respondents paired the hinges in addition to the edges. In the US, a quarter of the respondents view leather as a structural element, while 3/4 view it as an aesthetic covering, relying on cloth or cords for structural stability. How does pairing in these different ways impact the strength of the leather? we've looked at, is there a correlation between where respondents were trained and their opinions about leather thickness? And some feel that leather is a structural component of the object or the binding, while others view it as merely decorative. The studies have shown that excessive paring reduces leather strength, as we've talked about, by removing or reducing the corium leather that has been discussed today. So let's move on to the videos.
Regarding paring and thickness of leathers, for bookbinding purposes, the materials that we produced would be usually goat and calf, veg-tan goat, veg-tan calf. Those are the types of leathers that would be best suited, I think, for bookbinding because they have the best strength to thickness ratio. That is, most of the strength of the skin is in a much thinner area. The larger the hide, say if it's a bovine hide, you have a much thicker area, or a much thicker substance. And in order to split it down to a usable working thickness, you're ending up splitting off a good deal of the substance of the hide. And in doing so, what's left behind, although it still might be the same thickness as goat or calf, what's left behind doesn't really have much tear or stitch strength to it. So thinner hides tend to work better. We do split our leathers, certainly, excuse me, for binding and conservation. We usually end up splitting it to about 1 millimeter, so 2.5 ounces. That seems to be a good middle ground for most people, although we can have the leather split to whatever thickness a customer is looking for, provided that the skin is at least that thick to start with. The thinner you get, the more challenging it can be to properly split the leather. Denser hides, especially denser areas of skins, sometimes can cause a blade from a splitting machine to wobble, and that can cause uneven layers of thickness within a skin, which can be a problem. But for the most part, thinner hides, goat, calf, pig suede, and kangaroo tend to work very well. Pig and kangaroo are later additions, but they have a fairly good thickness to strength ratio.
And yeah, thank you to Bill for his introduction on the work of Betty Haynes. My answer to this question is simple, fundamental, and histological. This means that we must look at the leather in cross-section. Yeah, the same picture, and remember that when you tear down a leather from 1.4 millimeter to 0.6, you lose 80% of the strength of the leather. So here we have the strongest fibers, and upwards to the grain layers, we have the thin fibers at almost 90-degree angle. The cattle. The pictures here are my own. I was trained by Betty Haynes to do cross-section binding. So that's nice. Another commercial leather which is really split down to the grain more or less. And a full goat, small goat, where you have full thickness and a lot of strong fibers. A larger goat, pared down to 1.5 and only little of the corium left. That's the way also you don't need to do cross section, but look at the edge of the leather. Under the microscope, you can easily see the corium and the grain layer. So simply, to all what we have heard, if you pair the more you pare, the more you lose strength, and try to keep as much of the corium as possible. Well, I think we already have the recommendation. But it's not in all situations you can avoid paring, of course.
Dangers of shaving or splitting skins too thin are well documented, although the issues only really relate to the spine area of the book, that is having to take the strain of the board's opening. Upon request, we will thin skins for our customers, but only down to 0.6 or 0.7 millimeters, and not without telling them of the dangers. Whilst it is fine to split skin thin for inlay and onlay work, we would never recommend taking a full skin down to 0.5 of a millimeter if it is going to be used for binding. As you can see from this image, the skin is made up of the grain layer and the corium, but it is the thicker interwoven fibers in the corium that give the leather its strength. If too much is taken away from the corium, then there is no interweaving and the remaining fibers will just separate under strain. We judge the skins when they arrive with us to determine the thickness needed in order to ensure sufficient corium is left. We generally shave our Indian goat skins to around 0.8 to 0.9 millimeters and our smaller New Zealand goats and calf skin to around 0.7 of a millimeter. When we were having to purchase UK calf in the early 2000s, as opposed to the normal Scandinavian or New Zealand calf, the raw skins were much thicker, so for a few years we increased the standard thickness of the skins to around 0.8 of a millimeter. We have certainly come across some instances where customers have asked us to supply thicker than standard skins, only to discover later that they have spoke shaved the spine area down well below the safe recommended levels.
From a thickness perspective, when we think about leather and the microbes involved in that process, it's difficult to imagine how microbes may play, very strong roles in that aspect. There are a couple different aspects I think about here, though. One is that it's been shown in literature that we know different papers with different thicknesses do have different microorganisms that associate with them. The other thing I think about in the context of this is if the microbes are feeding off of the leather, obviously having more leather present, may sort of provide more food. And the last bit that it's anecdotal that I want to just throw out there is just thinking about how much sort of protection a thicker leather would provide against microbes that are really trying to degrade it, right? The sort of dogma might be that thicker leathers may have longer term protection or even provide, some sort of physical barrier to some of the internal fibers of the leather, right? And really fibers of the book even, or whatever it is that you're looking at, right? That thicker leather may provide some sort of protection that really inhibits microbes from getting into the internal structures. So there could be interesting things here, but it might be something if we're trying to understand the microbes involved in this process that we want to actually look at sort of each surface of the leather and what types of microbial communities may be associated with different thicknesses.
So basically everybody is saying paring or thinning as little as possible. Is that correct? Is that the consensus? Renee, did you have something to add?
Yes, just a short comment. When you pare down, you have thinner fibers. When you have thinner fibers, you have a larger area. So the chemical as well as the biological, microbiological deterioration will be quicker and faster. So that's also a part of this. So the thinner fiber, the larger area, the more exposed to degradation.
Right. And couple that with if we're adding alcohol and dyes and And we're creating a bit of a soup, a degradation soup, if you will.
Correct.
Any other thoughts?
Well, if not, we can move on to the final topic.
Bill, did you have something to say?
Well, I was going to just point out that yes, some people have the skins, the leather pared down to shall we say 0.6 or something like that. I'm glad to hear from David that they look at the skin itself and make a determination for the thickness. And I have worked with Jesse on some skins, getting the same skin paired to different thicknesses, and wanting to work with that to just make a determination similar to what Renee has already done with work with some of those skins that Jesse has provided to do an own in-house sort of testing of that. So just to learn more about the real effects of paring down to those thinness area, those thicknesses that are commonly used by some people. I know of one binder who gets the skin and sends it out to have it pared down even further. So I always cringe at the thought of skins being pared down too thinly for long-term longevity, durability, strength, all of those things.
One more thing that I might add too is, as David mentioned, looking at the skin, examining the skin as it comes in and trying to choose at that point whether to split it or not. And I don't know if I mentioned this in my answer, the recorded answer, but what would help in that determination of how thin you can split it is the size of the hide, which would hopefully correlate maybe to the age of the animal. You've got bovine hides, which are huge, but calf skins are more manageable of size. Instead of 40 to 50 square feet, you're looking at maybe more like 7 to 8 square feet, or even a slunk, for instance, a fetal calf skin, which can be 3 to 4 square feet in size. But those all they vary not only in size but in thickness. The younger the animal, the thinner the skin is likely to be, and the thinner it is, the more of the actual strength and substance of the skin is going to remain intact. So, I mean, when you're talking about, if you use goat or kid skin in particular, very, very young animal, those things can be, pretty thin, sometimes maybe a millimeter thick to start with. So every animal, the thinner it is, or I should say, the younger it is, usually the more strength it has.
And that's the younger the animal. That's a point that I would like to bring up with regard to some of our colleagues are doing miniature bindings, and therefore a need to use a leather that perhaps should come from an even younger animal. And I wonder about, sadly, some animals, if they're slaughtered too early or if they die naturally, if those skins could be tanned, maybe they would be much more beneficial for some of those really small bindings that are being done.
There's been traditions for a very long time, say during certain holidays, where they will slaughter goat or lamb at a very young age, for Easter or Passover, things like that. So there's, at least in my experience, no shortage of young hides available during certain times of the year, depending on certain religious holidays. So those are there. There's plenty of those to go around. One more thing I'll add is that we're looking at skins that are raised in modern agriculture environments and modern breeding. And if you are looking at hides or bindings with leather on them that are going back several hundred years or more, the hide and the physical structure of those animals and their hides are going to have changed a lot due to breeding and improvements in breeding.
Mhm.
So you go back further, and you've got smaller animals that weren't as well fed and weren't bred to have thick hides, or weren't bred to get to maturity at the same age as they are now, and that can certainly also have an effect on the thickness and the structure and strength of a hide.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think we need to move on because time's getting close here. The next topic is tooling, and Kristi is going to talk about that.
Yes, so we'll cover tooling very quickly here, and then we'll get to some Q&A and more discussion at the end. So this is our final topic for presentations today. And we came about it because in our interviews, we ascertained that there is an ongoing lack of demand for gold tooling, especially in institutional settings. And this leads to more use of gold foil stamping or blind tooling. The third of the respondents that use real gold leaf typically focus on fine binding. And then the solvents used for gold removal include lighter fluid, toluene, and historically benzene, although the latter two have fallen out of favor due to health concerns. And some respondents now remove gold using only an eraser or rubber. So our question to our panelists was, what are the effects of these practices on leather?
For the last question, we're thinking about gold tooling and how that may influence the leather. From a microbial perspective, it's really fascinating because we know metals such as gold and silver are highly antimicrobial. They work really well to kill microbes. The problem with it is that they are also very broad spectrum, and so they may kill microbes that you might want to keep in particular locations. But certainly thinking about gold tooling from my perspective is that it may influence the integrity of the leather, but also provide a very antimicrobial effect. And so it'd be interesting to look at the microbial communities on part of the leather that does contain gold versus part of leather that doesn't. And really see whether or not gold is really able to act on these microbial communities that live on the surfaces of leather. Even in a lot of medical performance type equipment, they can be silver coated or silver lined or gold lined, to provide this sort of antimicrobial protection. So it's quite interesting to think about it in the context of leathers.
So thanks for tackling our final discussion topic, Laura. Just a brief question about that, following up on your comments. In addition to the antimicrobial effects of the gold, would the heat from the tooling process also counteract any microbial growth that we might assume could be encouraged by the use of egg white glaire or shellac? Or how about the heat from the process if glaire is not used in the tooling?
Yeah, heat obviously is going to kill the microbes straight away. But what becomes important is what microbes colonize the leather after that heat is gone, right? So it's going to kill those microbes, but those microbes that are dead then also are nutrients for the next batch of microbes that come onto the leather, right? And so we call this microbial succession. So, different microbial communities will come on as the leather changes or as new things are done to it, or as, it's treated with new, with new chemicals, you name it. And so, yeah, the heat will kill things immediately, but then what are you putting on top of the leather that may contribute to sort of the downstream succession of microbes? I think that's probably more important there, or at least from my perspective. So there's been a lot of really great questions in the chat. I was actually just pulling up some publications to throw into the Q&A chat session about this sort of microbial ideology that goes along with leather. There's been some really cool, interesting papers that have, tried to find the microbes that cause things like purple spot and red heat. And so we know a little bit about how those are coming to be. Those are microbes acting on the leathers. But we also know that there's a lot of other microbes that live on leathers, including leathers that don't necessarily have those sort of disfigurations. And so, or are not necessarily degraded. And so it's like, how do we select for the good microbes that might be protective in some nature of excluding, microbes associated with, I want to call it disease because it's thinking about microbes kind of like infecting the leather, right? But thinking about things like red heat and purple spots, how do we keep those microbes away from the leather? And some of it is just thinking about microbial selection, but it's also thinking about succession, right? And thinking about what microbes might come next after the first ones are gone, or, if we can select for certain microbes and by treating the leather with something, is that what's going to be around 5 years or 10 years later, right? Or are there going to be different microbes that that follow on from that? I don't know if that really kind of answers most of the questions I think I've seen in the chat and that we've been talking about here, but I can paste some of those papers that look at just the overall sort of good or the regular microbes that are on leather, as well as some of the bad microbes. I think the best sort of bad microbe example is associated with sort of salt utilization on leather. So you can actually see these microbes that really like living in high salt conditions. They're called, they're actually archaea, they're not bacteria. It's another single-celled organism, but very microscopic. And they like to live in the presence of salt. And they are one of the microbes that's being found associated now with things like red heat. So certainly thinking about what we put on the leathers and what we're using to sort of preserve the leathers or not preserve, right, will control what microbes bind the leather or don't, and may contribute to sort of the long-term survival or, robusticity of the leather, if that makes any sense.
Definitely, and it's a fascinating topic for sure. Instead of continuing the tooling discussion specifically, I think at this point, Katie, if you wanted to run through the few final slides that we have, and then we'll get to the main Q&A.
Yep, let's do that. We might go a few seconds over, but we want to get to your questions. So we want to let you know the leather survey that we were discussing, you can still contribute to it. And I'll leave this slide here for a sec, but it will obviously be in the recording. We can also send you the links to this. There are some other interesting resources that we're working on. The Leather Research AIC wiki page has a lot of our research as well. So that's a great place to look. And there is a conference next week that is also free of charge. We'll be making a very short presentation, but it's a 2-day conference sponsored by ICOM, and it's in Europe. So it's early in the morning till around 1 o'clock. So without further ado, we want to say thank you, especially to our panelists and AIC and to Renee for the video. And without further ado, let's move on to our questions. And thank you for tackling some of them already, Laura. There was some about from Olivia about, rather than thin leather at the joint, we fold, crease, bone fold, or lightly hammer to reduce thickness. We know creasing breaks paper fibers. Would this be the same for leather? Any of our panelists want to tackle that one?
Unmute. Sorry, I was trying to find my unmute button there. I'd be happy to jump in on that one personally. So paper fiber is going to be quite different from leather fibers in the sense that if you gently introduce a fold into leather, it has the elastic ability to take that as its almost permanent form without breaking. If the leather is so inelastic that when you put a bend in it, that you're snapping fibers, then that leather is of fairly poor quality to begin with. So you should absolutely be able to crease, within reason, crease and fold most of your different types of leathers, but most definitely veg tan leathers without breaking fibers.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because we do find, and there's a question that talks about this too, we do find a lot of breakage at the joint, which is in a book where you're folding the board back and forth, but obviously you're doing it quite a lot. And over time, leather, I assume, loses its elasticity. So the question was really concerning the thicker skin and book functionality. Are there possible negative effects on the text blocks of thicker skin at the joints? I'm not sure that this is the case, but I was wondering about transmission of flex to the text block of a book rather than keeping flexing at the joints.
not actually familiar enough with book terminology to know what a text block is.
Oh, text block is just the pages of a book. So, you know, you usually, well, depends how you make a book. You make a cover, you have the paper, and you marry the two. The text block is the pages of the book.
Okay.
Well, maybe I'll see. Oops. Yeah, maybe, sorry, I thought I was muted. Maybe I'll jump in and speak to that. I think, I mean, I trained with Bill Anthony, and one of the things that was very important was the, again, not only the quality of the materials, but also the structure and a balance between all of the elements, all of the materials that are there. And I think that once you start using a thicker skin, you can accommodate that by, of course, you probably have thicker sewing cords that have been used. Maybe you've added a little extra space. Bill was a big proponent of adding a, he had a, what we call maybe I think some of my colleagues have called it the Bill Anthony joint, where he would specifically put a little bit of space between the shoulder and the board so as to accommodate a thicker leather so that it would not impinge or reduce the flexing of the cover. And of course, as I say that, I'm reminded of Gary Frost and his work, where he would have there would be quite a leveraging that was going on when opening up the cover of a book. So I think as book conservators, we need to take the strength of the leather into account and do whatever we can to use the leather as thick as possible in the hinge area. I mean, you know, books, you know, we work on these books. We want them to last as long as possible. And I think that choosing the leather appropriately for the book is paramount, and strength is part of that.
There's a follow-up on that, Bill, that one of our attendees asked that could the panelists express their thoughts about the qualities of leather from different animals? We may all agree that sheep is not to be used, but what about the differences between calf and goat? And sort of tangentially related, Jeff Peachy was wondering, has there been any further research concerning the strength of skins relative to where they're from? And he's referencing a 1905 report.
Well, from my perspective, I'm always wanting to use a goat skin as much as possible. If from a strength perspective, of course, calf can also be used, but it tends to get harmed more easily. It's more, I mean, the surface is, shall we say, more delicate to little dings and dents and everything. Whereas a goat skin tends, because of the grain pattern, if you do get a ding or a dent, you can sometimes work that out. But on a calf skin, it's a little more problematic. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'll stop right there since we're getting close to time. Maybe Renee has a point coming from a different background than maybe mine. Maybe he has a comment about the different leathers. Put you on the spot, Renee.
Well, I'm afraid I can't add much to what you already said, and what we heard that sheepskin is pure and or have less physical strength due to the fiber structure. And the other thing is that the goat skin is considered, and that's also what I remember the tests I've seen years ago, is the strongest because you leave more of the corium the goats, especially you have small goats compared to larger calf where you have to pare down. But there's one thing I like to add, that is when you fix part of the leather, the flesh side, you have a difference in the movement of the leather, not only when you bend, but also when it works, when moisture comes in and out, temperatures moves up and down. So it was right what you said, Bill, that the thicker the leather in these areas, the less will this difference in movement, physical movements, probably play a role in the long-term durability of the leather. But again, this also need more research and studies, and especially if you use paper. We know from gilt leather panels which have been restored and repaired with textiles on the back, that after some years it may have a tremendous effect on the condition of the leather because of the difference in physical behavior, especially regarding changes in relative humidity. So yeah, I'm afraid that's all I can add.
I do think it'll be really interesting to look at the microbes of leathers across different animals as we sort of push on with the research that we've been doing together. Because I think, there have to be microbial correlates that play into this. I know a lot of it is genetics and a lot of it is environment of the animal and, what they're eating, but I have to think about how that translates into what ends up in the leather, both when the animal is living, but also, post sort of tanning. I'll be really curious to see what that means in the future.
I just wanted to say also that, Laura, you were talking about the red heat and the purple spots that show up, and the causes of those. As handling as much raw material and raw hides as I do, I see those, I see that evidence often. But as you just were talking about, it'll be interesting to see how much of that, transfers to the end product, whether that stays intact all the way to the end, or whether that gets destroyed or altered in any way from a raw hide as it goes through those changes in pH and tanning and so on, to see how much of that remains.
Yeah, completely, Jesse. It's going to be exciting.
Well, we are a little bit beyond time. I wanted to once again thank everybody, panelists, AIC, everybody who took the time. I know 3 hours is a long time to sit and discuss leather with us. I really appreciate it, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It was really interesting.